They laughed when the Jug lumbered into view, a stubby, barrel-chested airplane that looked more like an armored milk can than a sleek fighter. Pilots nicknamed it the Jug, others called it a flying truck. Still others joked it was a dinosaur that should have stayed in the sketchbook. That laughter was the opening note of a story that would end in alarm and, for many on the receiving end, annihilation. The P-47 Thunderbolt began as a counterintuitive answer to a wartime problem: how to put a brutally powerful engine into an airframe that could survive what other fighters could not. Alexander Kartveli, the design lead at Republic Aviation, did something radical. He built almost everything around the Pratt Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a two-row, 18-cylinder radial engine that was itself a compact arsenal. Around it, he wrapped a massive airframe, a stout fuselage, and a turbo supercharger system supplied by General Electric that let the engine breathe where it mattered most, at high altitude. The result was ungainly on the ground and slow to turn in the sky. It was exactly the opposite of what the classic dogfighter looked like, and that first impression cost a P-47 dearly. By spring 1943, when Thunderbolts first appeared over occupied Europe, their baptism by fire was rough. Radios failed, takeoffs were tricky under the weight, and the early climb and turning rates invited harsh comparisons to the lithe Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190. Losses in the first months fed the mockery. For pilots schooled in the principles of close-in, turning fights, the P-47's weaknesses seemed unforgivable. Yet the plane's apparent shortcomings masked a different logic, a logic that would transform it from punchline to predator. The core of that logic was power and survivability, not agility. The R2800 delivered large, reliable horsepower. Coupled to a turbo supercharger, it could keep that power at altitudes of roughly 25,000 to 30,000 feet, heights where many air battles over Europe were decided. The turbo supercharger is easiest to picture not as a mystery box, but as a way of reusing energy. Exhaust gases skin a turbine, which drives a compressor that forces denser air into the cylinders. At high altitude, where the air is thin and engines normally choke, the turbocharger essentially gives the engine a second wind, a supply of oxygen-rich air so it can produce near sea-level power while climbing above the clouds. For the P-47, that meant sustained speed and energy at altitudes where German fighters might be less comfortable hunting or lingering. More important than peak speed or graceful turning were survival and weaponry. The Thunderbolt was heavily built. It carried armor around the cockpit and self-sealing fuel tanks and sat atop a radial engine that could absorb damage the liquid-cooled inline engines of many Axis fighters could not. Radial engines lack the vulnerable coolant systems that, if punctured, rapidly boil away a plane's life. Pilots and ground crews found again and again that P-47s could return from missions that would have been fatal to other fighters. Those returns didn't make great propaganda headlines in the early days. They did, however, alter the attitudes of those who had laughed at the Jug's looks. Firepower was another surprise. The Thunderbolt entered combat with an armament that read like overkill to pilots used to lighter gun loads. Multiple .50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns mounted in the wings, each fed with generous ammunition reserves. The effect in combat was visceral. From a diving P-47, bursts from those guns created a dense wall of bullets. Aircraft that were structurally sound but unprepared for such concentrated fire did not survive long when they walked into it. The weapon fit turned encounters into short, brutal episodes of kinetic certainty. A high-speed approach, a few controlled bursts, then climb away before the adversary could respond. Human stories drove the learning curve. Major Robert S. Johnson is one name that recurs in accounts of P-47 toughness. His survival in a badly damaged Thunderbolt became emblematic, not as a Hollywood tale, but as a practical demonstration that the aircraft's construction could save a pilot. Historians and combat reports attribute examples like his to the design choices that favored redundancy, armor, and the radial engine's ruggedness. These were not lucky anecdotes alone. They were reproducible advantages that influenced tactics. Doctrine adapted to match design. The P-47 was unsuited to prolonged turning fights. It was built to convert altitude into killing speed. Pilots and commanders evolved a boom and zoom technique. Climb to altitude, dive on the enemy at high speed, fire controlled bursts, and use the remaining energy to climb back to a safe height. Energy management, not maneuverability, was the tactical currency. From higher up, the Thunderbolt could choose its engagements and disengage on its terms. In pairs and flights, Thunderbolts became executioners of precise high-speed strikes rather than participants in the tight, spiraling melee that the Luftwaffe favored. That doctrine dovetailed with escort requirements and later with the plane's evolution into a fighter-bomber. The Thunderbolt could escort bombers to and from high-altitude targets, and when the war moved toward a ground-centric phase, most notably around D-Day and the Normandy campaign, the aircraft's capacity to carry bombs and rockets turned it into a formidable interdiction platform. Stripped of the stigma of awkwardness, the P-47 came to be dreaded on the ground as well as in the air. Ground units coined the term JBO, fighter-bomber, as an epithet and as a dread. Veterans on both sides later referred to a condition sometimes called JBO fever, the acute demoralization and disruption inflicted on troops and logistics by sudden, relentless fighter-bomber attacks. Understanding how an engine and a forceful design mindset translated into strategic effect requires stepping back from the cockpit to the factory. The P-47 story is as much about production as it is about performance. Republic Aviation, working with an industrial base ready for scale, produced Thunderbolts by the thousands. The R-2800 itself was manufactured under wartime schedules by multiple firms and supported by a logistics chain that ensured spares and replacements reached units promptly. Pilot training, too, expanded to funnel crews into the cockpit with the necessary skills for energy tactics and ground attack work. In a war of attrition, American advantages in production and support turned aircraft losses into manageable costs. Where the Luftwaffe relied heavily on experienced aces and a doctrine that prized individual pilot skill, the American model accepted material losses to sustain pressure. That difference was not a moral judgment, but a strategic contrast. One side tried to multiply elite pilots, the other multiplied machines and the industrial capacity to keep them flying. The turning point in recognition usually shows up in the record of combat performance and in the words of those who faced the Thunderbolt. German assessments and memoirs of Luftwaffe leaders indicate a growing unease not merely with the P-47's survivability, but with its combined offensive capability. Adolf Galland and other senior officers noted that Allied air power had become not only quantitatively larger, but qualitatively able to impose attritional pressure on air and ground systems alike. The P-47's mixture of altitude performance, heavy armament, and ruggedness contributed to that pressure, especially in the months surrounding the Normandy invasion, when interdiction of movers, supplies, and transport became a decisive factor. Technically, the Thunderbolt's uniqueness lies in conservative, resolute engineering choices. Designers accepted weight and size penalties in exchange for a platform that could mount a large engine, carry heavy armament, and fit armor without becoming dangerously underpowered. The turbo supercharger was a critical enabler. Consider a simple analogy. At sea level, an engine drinks deeply of oxygen. Climb to the thin air of the stratosphere, and it sips thinly. A turbo supercharger turns wasted exhaust energy into a mechanical pump that forces denser air into the engine, so the cylinders get more oxygen and can burn more fuel. That increased intake is what allowed the P-47 to sprint and sustain speed at altitudes where fuel and engine power often dictated the outcome of escort and interceptor missions. Survivability was not merely about returning to base, it was also about mission persistence. A Thunderbolt could take ground fire and remain a fighting aircraft. Formations that had lost one or more aircraft to damage still could complete strafing runs or rocket attacks. Ground crews developed procedures to repair and turn around damaged Thunderbolts quickly. And battlefield damage that would have grounded other aircraft sometimes proved reparable in the field. That resilience amplified the tactical effectiveness of P-47 units because pilots could be sent back into the fight with casualties that, while serious, were not necessarily fatal to the platform. The armament package deserves another close look because it was more than simple firepower. It structured how the plane was used. With multiple .50 caliber Browning M2s in the wings, the P-47 didn't need a single decisive shot to disable an enemy. It could deliver a sustained torrent of rounds that shredded control surfaces and incapacitates engines. That made short, high-speed passes effective. In ground attack roles, the Thunderbolt could carry bombs or unguided rockets that turned offers of shelter, convoys, trains, bridges into targets of acute vulnerability. Reports from the Normandy campaign and the weeks that followed emphasized rail and road interdiction, sleepers that could not be replaced, bridges rendered unusable, and columns of supply vehicles left exposed and vulnerable to aircraft that could loiter at altitude, choose a target, and strike with concentrated firepower. The shift from air superiority escort to fighter-bomber sustained the P-47's relevance even as newer, sleeker fighters like the P-51 Mustang captured public imagination. The Mustang's long range made it an excellent long-range escort. The Thunderbolt's role was complementary. Where the Mustang chased enemy fighters to clear the skies, the Thunderbolt could turn its design priorities to other needs, hitting ground targets, dominating the higher energy sphere of combat, and surviving hits that would stop a lighter fighter in its tracks. That functional complement is part of why the P-47's legacy reaches beyond its own production numbers. Production tells a blunt, powerful story. Republic Aviation and its suppliers delivered the Thunderbolt in numbers that made the plane more than a niche solution. It became a standard workhorse of the U.S. Army Air Forces in the European and Mediterranean theaters. Official production totals put the figure in the tens of thousands. Commonly cited records list approximately 15,000 to 16,000 Thunderbolts of various marks produced during the war. That scale meant entire wings could be equipped and sustained, and that spoke directly to the strategy of attrition. If you could replace losses reliably and at scale, you could keep pressure on enemy systems until they frayed. Attrition's human face is complicated. On one hand, replacing aircraft at scale required a painlessly efficient industrial base and a logistical system that could get engines, parts, and trained pilots to the front. On the other hand, every sortie carried risk. The Thunderbolt's reputation for bringing pilots home alive more often than some contemporaries cannot erase the loss and cost of aerial warfare. Accounts of damaged P-47s returning with severe battle scars, sometimes with portions of wing missing or huge holes in the fuselage, became part of unit lore. These stories are testimonies to design choices that valued robustness. They are also reminders that survival and the ability to return to base could affect morale and unit cohesion in ways easier to measure than raw statistics. What did all this add up to on the battlefield? The P-47's tactical adaptation and industrial mass combined to make it a significant contributor to Allied operations across multiple campaigns. During the push from Normandy into occupied Europe and beyond, Thunderbolts disrupted reinforcements, slowed resupply, and helped to erode the mobility that the German armies depended upon. Pilots and commanders described the plane as particularly unnerving for ground troops because it could appear suddenly, inflict heavy damage, and disappear back into the sky. The effect was less about the individual drama of a dogfight and more about systematic attrition. Bits and pieces of logistics and movement harried and degraded until operational capability waned. German leaders understood the problem.
Whether in intercepted reports, intelligence summaries, or post-war reflections, there are recurring observations that Allied strength was less about any single machine than the combined force. Numbers of aircraft, depth of production, and the ability to sustain attacks over time. Luftwaffe officers in memoirs and recorded assessments grappled with how to respond when material superiority met flexible tactics. An ace, as Galland and others acknowledged, could not change the arithmetic of mass and supply. That realization helped shift the tone from derisive dismissal of the Jug to a grudging, sometimes fearful respect. The P-47's legacy also has technical descendants. Its philosophy of durability, heavy forward firepower, and mission survivability lives on in later aircraft designed to operate in low-level, high-threat environments. The Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II, which appeared decades later, is often described as a philosophical successor. Slow relative to jets, intentionally built to survive hits, and armed to deliver devastating firepower in support of ground forces. The continuity is not direct lineage in manufacturing or systems, but a shared design answer to similar tactical problems. When the battlefield requires a machine that can take damage and keep fighting, engineers and commanders have returned to the same basic set of trade-offs.
As the war ended and historians examined campaigns, the P-47's transformation from joke to juggernaut became clearer. Official records and post-war studies attribute to Thunderbolt units a significant role in both air and ground interdiction. Exact tallies of enemy aircraft destroyed, vehicles knocked out, or bridges demolished are often framed in official terms, claim totals, unit reports, and corroborating battlefield records, and should be read with the usual caution historians apply to wartime claims. What is less disputable is the pattern. An aircraft designed with a particular set of priorities, initially derided, adapted tactically, and then multiplied industrially, can alter the operational landscape. There is a human strain woven through this technical and strategic narrative. Mechanics who worked long hours to keep engines running, armorers who fitted guns and rockets, squadron leaders who changed doctrine under fire, and pilots who learned to trade turning fights for energy tactics all contributed to the P-47's redefinition. Major Robert S. Johnson's survival is one emblematic story among many. It symbolizes how individual lives and engineering decisions intersected in concrete ways. Accounts like his are not meant to glorify conflict. They are reminders of decisions made for survival and effectiveness, and of the cost that accompanied them. The arc of the Thunderbolt captures a larger truth about military technology and warfare. Underestimation is a common opening, and engineering plus adaptation can close the gap rapidly. A design that appears clumsy can hide decisive strengths when matched to doctrine and supported by industrial depth. The laughter that greeted the Jug in 1943 was not simply misplaced scorn. It was a misunderstanding of what the airplane was meant to do. By the time Allied air operations reached their full tempo, the P-47 had become a central instrument in a combined strategy of air superiority, interdiction, and close support. They laughed, then the sky filled with a wall of lead. That transformation is the Thunderbolt story. An aircraft dismissed for its shape, but ultimately respected for its effect. The P-47 did not single-handedly win the air war. It was one element in a complex, industrially powered campaign that combined doctrine, production, and the courage of those who flew and maintained it. Its legacy endures in the way engineers and tacticians think about survivability and firepower, and in the lineage of aircraft that followed the same basic instincts: build it tough, give it teeth, and let numbers and logistics do the rest. If this deep dive into the P-47's unlikely rise grabbed your attention, like and subscribe for more detailed histories of the machines and minds that shaped the air war. In the end, the Thunderbolt remains a lesson in humility for those who judge a weapon by its cover. The ungainly silhouette hid a philosophy. Prioritize endurance and power over elegance and let tactics exploit those strengths. From mockery to menace, from a milk bottle nickname to a reputation that inspired caution and dread, the P-47 Thunderbolt earned its place in the narrative of World War II aviation, a testament to engineering, industrial might, and the human capacity to adapt under fire. If you want to follow the Thunderbolt story into related chapters, the P-51 Mustang's escort revolution, or the A-10's modern embodiment of rugged close air support, check the links on screen and subscribe for weekly deep dives into the machines that changed history.